You
I
just
know
hurt my heart, but okay.
I have my limitations, and that's one of them. I'll take it one step further. Since I am no longer somebody who pines for everyone to like him, I'll admit this to you as well. Not only do I do that, I will root through the dirty clothes hamper to take out my dirty stuff and just wash that.
Oh.
Because it makes it so much easier when it's in the dryer for me to just take it out because I don't have to sift through other people's clothes.
All right, listeners, you can direct your hate mail to
Kristen Finch.
Modern Love is produced by Julia Botero, Christina Josa, Emily Lang, and Reba Goldberg. It's edited by Mark Pagan, Jen Poyant, and Paula Schumann. Our executive producer is Jen Poyant. This episode was mixed by Daniel Ramirez. Our show was recorded by Maddie Masiello. Fact-checking by Caitlin Love and Kelsey Kudak. The Modern Love theme music is by Dan Powell. Original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, and Diane Wong. Digital production by Bahima Jablani and Nelga Lokley. The Modern Love column is edited by Daniel Jones. Mia Lee is the editor of Modern Love Projects. I'm Anna Martin. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is supported by FX's Feud, Capote vs. the Swans. Inspired by actual events, the series tells the story of writer Truman Capote and the women he betrayed, the original housewives. They were society's most elite women, rich, glamorous socialites who defined a bygone era of high society New York. From creator Ryan Murphy, this drama series features an all-star cast including Naomi Watts, Demi Moore, Diane Lane, Molly Ringwald, Callista Flockhart, Chloe Sevigny, and Tom Hollander as Truman Capote. FX's Feud, all new Wednesdays on FX. Stream on Hulu.
This is The Sunday Story. I'm Andrew Mambo, a producer on the show, and I'm sitting in for Aisha Roscoe, who's out this week. Today, we're going to be talking about guns. Guns regularly make headline news for all the wrong reasons. But as often as we talk about guns, we don't really talk much about our relationship with them. And from my years as a producer, connecting with people around the country, I know the relationship we have with guns can be so different and complex and at times even contradictory. And that got me thinking about point of view and how the story of American gun culture often depends on who's telling it. Today, I'm joined by Alon Stevens. He's the host of a new podcast from WBUR called The Gun Machine, which looks at the ways the gun industry has developed and thrived since the founding of the nation.
For most of America's history, there is this symbiotic supportive relationship between the government and the gun industry.
Alon comes to this story as a former member of the military, a former police officer, a victim of gun violence, a black man in America, and now as a journalist with The Trace, a newsroom dedicated to reporting on American gun violence. Alon, welcome to The Sunday Story.
Thanks for having me.
So, your podcast digs into the complex relationship between the gun industry and the government. And even though that relationship can seem to be antagonistic, you show it's actually often mutually beneficial. And you start at the beginning of this relationship. You go all the way back to the founding of the nation and tell the story of this famous inventor, Eli Whitney, who I think a lot of people know the name, but don't connect him necessarily with guns.
Yes, that Eli Whitney, the cotton gin Eli Whitney. And so Eli Whitney created cotton gin and solidified pretty much the cotton plantation economy in the American South, but the patents were so insecure for him that he pretty much made no money on it. So he went back up north where he interacted with the early American government who was having an issue. Now that America was newly independent, they needed weapons, and particularly they needed a technological upgrade, interchangeable parts. And so interchangeable parts essentially is something that we kind of take for granted. We see it in cars, we see it in computers today, but it's the ability to essentially standardize parts. So if one part breaks, right, you can just take that part out, replace that part with the identical part, and everything fits back together. This was a promise that Eli Whitney said he can make, and at the time this was like a monumentous weapons upgrade for the country.
Yeah, and these inventors didn't just change the mechanics of the way guns were made, they changed the way American society thought about guns. And I'm actually thinking in particular about people like Samuel Colt.
So Samuel Colt comes during the early 1800s, right? And essentially he is confronting this major problem that a lot of American gun manufacturers are dealing with, right? That business is really good when they can sell to the government during wartime, but again, how do you get these weapons sold to new customers? And so he decides to tap in to the civilian masses. He decides to sell something even better, which is the need for a gun. And so he starts telling these stories, spinning these yarns of conflict and combat, many of them involving regular old American citizens. And so he goes up and sells his gun to abolitionists up north. He doubles back down and sells it to Confederates down south. He tells them that, hey, you may be under attack by indigenous people. You may be under attack by Mexicans. You may be under attack from all of these elements. And with that, it sells a ton of guns.
Right, and as you point out, that message gets massive amplification 100 years later by Hollywood, specifically through classic Western films.
Get 3 coffins ready.
And the gun becomes the centerpiece, a focal point, an identity, a main characteristic of Americans battling out with many times other Americans on screen and in fiction. And this sells a lot of guns and sells a lot of guns to this day.
My mistake. 4 coffins.
So even from the early 1800s, guns are being marketed to Americans as a necessary means of protection. And you know, that also is an argument we hear around the Second Amendment nowadays, though, that Americans have to have a means to defend themselves from government overreach. But you talked to Carol Anderson, who's a professor of history at Emory University, and what she says, like, it kind of flips the whole notion of this citizen militia and who they were actually protecting.
The bad history that we have had about the Second Amendment, how it gets cloaked in this nobility of the militia fighting off domestic tyranny and fighting off a foreign invasion, when in fact the militia really wasn't really good at either of those. What it was effective at was putting down slave revolt.
And the Second Amendment, Anderson says, was really just, meant to keep the South happy.
The Second Amendment was the bribe to the South to not scuttle the Constitution of the United States and to therefore not scuttle the nation itself, because the need for the militia, the need to protect the white community from the enslaved population.
I just never thought of framing it that way. Can you explain how the gun came to be this, this tool for managing slavery-based economy, and how that history has been ignored in favor of the myth around the strong militia?
Yeah, so one of the foundations of this country were laid out to fit around the economy of slavery, not the other way around. Slavery as an industry had already existed. The second thing that people need to understand, and this kind of just gets ignored because people don't delve into a lot of criminal justice records and history around slavery, but there was always constant resistance. And so there's constant slave patrols, and there's a constant need to keep one's eye open because there are stories and fears of slaves grabbing a knife and deciding, I'm done with this, right? This is where the Second Amendment comes into play, where many of the framers say, listen, if you do not include this security backstop for us, we're not going to be part of this fledgling nation. And so this is where the Second Amendment kind of becomes this tool that says, okay, we will allow you to keep your individuals armed.
And of course, to make that happen, the government needs a gun industry, right?
Absolutely.
But it goes back to this relationship between the industry and the government that has been there from the beginning. And you go to one place where that relationship started, Springfield, Massachusetts, which, as you point out in the podcast, it was a main manufacturing base for military weapons for much of U.S. history. And you end up going to Springfield and seeing how it's been transformed by guns. Can you just tell us a bit about what the city's like today?
You know, I love that you brought up Springfield, because I think that's such like a linchpin to the podcast and such a snapshot of what I feel like is happening in just so many American cities. When we talk about gun violence, I think we all want to lead with these kind of talking point towns. The Chicagos, the Baltimores, the New Yorks, right? These major cities that are kind of exemplars of American crime and American shootings and the shooting debate. But they also have a lot of resources, they have a lot of attention brought to them, et cetera, et cetera. You go to a place like Springfield, and it is just like a handful of dudes literally driving around trying to stop people from shooting each other.
And so in Springfield, you met with this youth worker named Damian Johnson, who's trying to interrupt and stop gun violence. And there's this really interesting exchange between the two of you while you're driving around the city, where Damian tells you about the changes in the kinds of guns he's seen in the streets.
You know, back in the day, you're lucky if you were to get your hands on like a little 32 Jennings or something like that. Now, it's so common. These guys want assault rifles, specifically AK-47s. I seen a kid running around with a Scar H, just a military weapon.
When I heard that, you know, the first time it's just shocking to me, like thinking of having, you know, young people, young kids having military-grade weapons. It just seems absolutely wild.
This has happened for like a couple of reasons. One of the things is that just more people are now technically proficient with modding guns, piecing guns, building guns together, customizing guns to not only get them to shoot, but make them easier to shoot, make them more reliable to shoot, get them to do what you want them to do. And yeah, it's a semi-automatic handgun, but now you look in here, it's a semi-automatic handgun, which is like a shortened down AR-15 that shoots out a .223 with a 30-round magazine, 40-round magazine. It's been milled out. It's got a holographic optic sight. It's got a suppressor on it, and you could drop it, you know, under your coat. The other thing about it too is that the technology and the ability to get these things has only gotten easier as well. And so I tell people that the cost of some of these weapons can be expensive, but the more Americans that buy weapons, the more the companies produce weapons and weapon parts, and the cheaper they get. And all of these have kind of converged where the guns you see out on the street aren't just basic anymore. They're almost perfect in some regards.
You're listening to The Sunday Story. We'll be right back.
Support for NPR and the following message come from USAFacts.org. How has the U.S. population grown? What does a $15 an hour wage buy? USA Facts has nonpartisan data to answer these big questions. Visit USAFacts.org to learn more. This message comes from Jackson. Seek clarity in retirement planning at Jackson.com. Jackson is short for Jackson Financial Inc., Jackson National Life Insurance Company, Lansing, Michigan, and Jackson National Life Insurance Company of New York, Purchase, New York.
This message comes from NPR sponsor BetterHelp. No relationship is easy all the time. In fact, the best friendships, partnerships, and family connections come from putting in the time and effort to make them great. Give your relationships some love with BetterHelp's convenient, affordable online therapy. Visit BetterHelp.com/NPR today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/NPR.
We're back with The Sunday Story. I'm Andrew Mambo in for Aisha Roscoe, and I'm talking with Alon Stevens, a reporter for The Trace, a newsroom dedicated to reporting on guns and gun violence in America. Alon is also the host of a new podcast, The Gun Machine. So, Alon, can I ask you, are you a gun owner? I mean, I've actually wondered about this question. Like, can I ask you this?
Yeah, I'm a gun owner.
It's like asking somebody how much money they make?
I'm a gun owner.
I don't actually know.
Man, it's crazy, too, because actually a lot of the sounds in there are my guns. Actually, the very first sound of the podcast, right? So you hear that, that's the sound of a 30-round magazine piece. It's the sound of a magazine getting slammed to an AR-15. That's my AR-15, and that is my Magpul magazine going into it. And so, yeah, I know. I and it's like a shock because I get so many people who are like, "You must hate guns." And actually, I tell people to do this job, and I think sometimes to do it well, you almost have to have a curiosity, a fascination, some sort of like for guns. And you can hear it also in the podcast too when I do get around shooters and shooting and guns, and firearms are such an identifier, right? There's such a saying a gun owner has like some sort of meaning. I've always been somewhat drawn to it. It was something that was introduced to me by my father. I'm from Texas. I grew up in Texas, and so there is definitely a normalcy to firearms in that environment.
You've actually got a really interesting background.
Yeah, I never had any intention of ever being a journalist at all.
I mean, you were in the military, in law enforcement, and now you're a reporter covering, guns and what you call the heavy metal beat. Can you just walk me through how you got here, like how you got to this point?
I came from a family down in Texas that was very pragmatic and had a military background. My father was in the military, both of my grandfathers were in the military. And so my parents told me, you need to do a profession that is needed, that is necessary. And for me, I was actually looking to join federal law enforcement. I was applying for all sorts of, pretty much all the alphabet soups, 3-letter agencies, FBI, the DEA, all of them, Secret Service. And during that waiting period, because it's such a long period, I ended up volunteering at a public radio station. And I saw that there was just such a significant gap between violence, criminal justice, firearms. So many Americans are dying from this, yet the information behind it was just not there. And so early on, I had started off, I actually did my first investigative report because while I didn't necessarily know, the journalistic path from my background, I still knew investigations, I still knew paperwork, I still knew that world. And it wasn't really until I saw just the secrecy behind it and how hard it was to get information. And like I said, so many Americans are dying from this, yet the information behind it was just not there. And so what is occurring is Americans are dying in the dark, and that bothered me. I tell a lot of people, right, journalists, it's not our job to really advocate for anything, but there's one thing that we can advocate for, and that is transparency.
Yeah. You have such a unique perspective. I mean, as is everybody. I grew up in Canada, so the culture that I grew up around guns is just very, very different from here. And even as a kid, I didn't know anybody that had a gun at their home, except my grandfather. It was just mostly for hunting. I remember shooting with him, and he's taught me how to shoot when I was young, and it was really fun, and have great memories about it. But like, I never felt the need to have that gun myself or need it for any specific reason. So I'm actually curious, like, from what you found in your years of reporting and your experience in the gun communities you've been in, like, what is the basis of that kind of attraction, that need, that like want to have those firearms?
I think American gun culture, the reason why people want guns now is somewhat different than what the majority of Americans wanted guns for 30 or 40 years ago. One of the things that has been consistently brought up among sociologists and criminologists is that we just have urbanized very rapidly. And as we have urbanized, people are now confronted with more communal city problems rather than rural American problems. And so when you look at like gun advertisements from old gun magazines years ago, a lot of the firearms being sold were based on American heritage. Use the weapon that your grandpappy used to have because it's reliable. Don't get any old newfangled whatever. Trust the Colt 1911 because it's been doing the same thing since 1911 when it came out. And then suddenly, as we kind of urbanize and people are closer to people, we become to get more afraid of each other, and that changes the prerogative to self-defense weapons. Now, self-defense weapons are implicitly made to kill and dominate against one's enemy. On top of that, when we look in our American history, we are a fundamentally distrustful society. And that's exactly what Samuel Colt took advantage of, right? That fragmentation, the distrust from one's neighbor. And so when you have those two kind of sociological factors at play, it creates this really perfect storm where you're the most developed nation in the world that has tons of domestic shootings.
And that reminds me that, in The Gun Machine, you point out that although mass shootings make the big headlines, they only account for a small fraction of the total gun deaths and injuries each year. And the bigger problem that you point out is happening on a smaller and much more personal level. You tell one story that really illustrates that point, and that's about Damian Johnson, the youth worker in Springfield. Can you tell me a bit about Damian's story?
Yeah, so Damian actually starts off before he worked with ROCO, which is a violence interruption organization. He was part of a criminal street gang, and his specialty was doing essentially gun modifications.
I didn't build ghost guns because they didn't exist, but I would make decorations on people's barrels. I would add all sorts of fancy attachments.
And he had an incident where he was playing with a gun and he accidentally killed his younger brother.
My little brother was the kindest human being I know. He's the only human being I've ever met that never actually wanted anything from me other than my company. He's such a good person, and it's just a fucked up situation.
And it had great consequences for him. He would actually get charged and get sent to prison for that for a period of time.
Yeah, it's such a heartbreaking story, and you really feel it in Damian's voice when you talk to him. And in this series, you share your own story of how gun violence impacted you. Are you good? Are you okay to share that story here?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
What was your experience? What happened to you?
So in 2008, I found my dad and he had shot himself. I was in my early 20s, and I was very close to my father. And I walked in one day, and he had taken his own life, and it had profound changes, I think, on my family. Things that a lot of people don't see. Things that happen after the funeral. One of the things that we often forget is simply the gravity of death. That when you rip out someone unexpectedly from a home or a community or a job, it has rippling effects that are permanent. Some of them are just simple, like you work for a small business and a guy gets shot and killed or dies. What happens to that small business? Right? It shuts down. It has economic effect. What happens to the children of that person? Well, they don't do well. They don't necessarily just become these productive citizens that find healing and peace and just move on and stuff. They don't. They carry that baggage and burden, and often the goal is simply to remain functional, right, in a society that doesn't understand them, that, often is obsessed about talking about violence, but not really even understanding it. There's a lot of people who use gun violence as a vehicle for political debate or debate about something else. I bring up slavery, that there's a period in American history where people were sitting at dinner tables discussing the pros and cons of abolition, and neither one of them were actually in chains. None of them were actually the harmed individuals. And when it comes to the American gun violence conversation, the harmed individuals are not centered. And the thing is, there's a lot of us. There's a whole lot of us. There's a ton of us, right? And I wanted to let people just taste a little bit of that on how it really is.
You shared your story of your father tragically taking his own life with a gun. You report on gun violence, but you also own guns, and I imagine you enjoy your guns and being a gun owner. How do you kind of hold both of those truths at the same time, and how does that impact you in the work you do now at the Trace?
The kaleidoscope
Thank you for choosing McDonald's. May you use your mobile app today?
Yep, it's 5655.
5655. Okay.
I'll take a sausage burrito and a sausage McMuffin.
Any sauce for your burrito, hon?
Mild, please.
Okay.
And I got a coupon for a free hash brown.
The little yellow coupon?
Yeah,
Okay. Anything else for you there?
that's all.
Alright, that total will be $3 per Sunday.
Thanks.
And feelings that I have for the firearm, I think grounds me, to be honest. Like I say, like you can tell that I enjoy firearms. A lot of the professions, the life that I lived, you know, being in the military, going to law enforcement, carrying a gun every day. A lot of the guns I bought after, you know, my dad took his life. So many Americans are arguing viscerally about firearms because they are a symbol for so many different things, like these beliefs. The problem, though, is that they try to tell you to pick one, right? That you either gotta be all in on one or all in on the other one, you know? And you don't have to be that way, right? And so when I pick up a gun, I see these moments that are good moments, right? But I also have to see my dad's death. I have to see the mass shootings. I have to see colonization. I have to see white supremacy. And that is the objective gun. You see what I'm saying? To deny one fails to understand the whole.
I hope that your podcast is a huge part of that, you know, the reimagining of America's relationship with guns. Thank you very much for your series and your reporting and for coming to talk to me about it today on the Sunday Story.
Thanks for having me.
That is Alon Stevens, a reporter from The Trace and the host of a new podcast from WBUR called The Gun Machine. This episode of the Sunday Story was produced by Dan Gurma and Grace Tatter. It was edited by Jenny Schmidt and Ben Brock Johnson. Our engineer for this episode was Maggie Muthar. It was fact-checked by Cecile Davis-Vasquez and Greta Pinninger. Our team includes Justine Yan and Liana Simpson. Our executive producer is Irene Noguchi. You can hear the entire Gun Machine podcast at wbur.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the history of the Second Amendment, check out NPR's history podcast Throughline and their episode, The Right to Bear Arms. We appreciate hearing from you, so feel free to reach out to us at thesundaystory@npr.org. Up First is back tomorrow with all the headline news you need to start your week. I'm Andrew Mambo. Have a great weekend.
I'm Peter Sagal. NPR is very serious, mostly. It treats newsmakers with all due respect, almost all the time. It brings you the most important information about the issues that really matter, usually. And it never asks famous people about things they don't know anything about, except once in a while. Join us for The Great Exception. Listen to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the news quiz from NPR.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Bombas. Bombas makes absurdly soft socks, underwear, and t-shirts. And for every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness. Get 20% off your first purchase at bombas.com/NPR and use code NPR. This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify, the global commerce platform that helps you sell and show up exactly the way you want to. Customize your online store to your style. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/NPR.
Dynamics, and recently the executive director of the newly created Boston Dynamics AI Institute that focuses on research and the cutting edge, on creating future generations of robots that are far better than anything that exists today. He has been leading the creation of incredible Leggett robots for over 40 years at CMU, at MIT, the legendary MIT Leg Lab, and then of course Boston Dynamics with amazing robots like Big Dog, Atlas, Spot, and Handle. This was a big honor and pleasure for me. This is Alex Friedman. Please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Mark Reibert. When did you first fall in love with robotics?
Well, I was always a builder from a young age. I was lucky. My father was a frustrated.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Satva. Satva luxury mattresses are every bit as elegant as the most expensive brands, but because they're sold online, they're about half the price. Visit SAATVA.com/NPR and save an additional $200.
Hi, this is Hannah from Queens, New York, calling in from my apartment as I watch my 9-week-old kittens, Wombat and Wallaby, discover the amazing joys of the living room. This podcast was recorded at
12:35 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, February 15th, 2024.
Things may have changed by the time you hear it, but I'll still be cuddling with these little monsters. Okay, here's the show.
Are they going to be confused and think they're a wombat and a wallaby? I don't know what kind of awareness they have of global wildlife, but those are A+ names. That is great. Hey there, it's the NPR Politics Podcast. I'm Sarah McCammon. I cover the presidential campaign. I'm Danielle Kurtzleben. I also cover the presidential campaign.
And I'm Asma Khalid. I cover the White House.
Vice President Kamala Harris is in Munich this week for a conference on global security, the week after Republicans rejected a border bill that would have included military funding for Ukraine. Asma, you're there in Germany with Vice President Harris for the Munich Security Conference. What's it been like so far, and what's on the Vice President's schedule?
The VP is prepping for what is being billed as a major foreign policy speech that she's delivering here tomorrow in Munich. She arrived earlier today, and as she got up, I was going to say I wanted to share the story with you because I feel like one of the things about having a woman in this job is I think a lot of foreign leaders don't always have a clear sense of how to relate to her and what her role is, and so she's coming down off of Air Force 2 in Munich to attend this very high-level security conference, and one of the ministers here in Germany welcomes her with a heart-shaped cookie cake. And, some of the other journalists and I were wondering afterwards, can you imagine a scenario in which, I don't know, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, or someone else would have been, welcomed with a heart-shaped cookie cake?
Feels very Valentine's Day, doesn't it?
But to me, it just also signifies that there has been a lot of curiosity about what the vice president is, what she represents on the international stage, not just, back home domestically about who she is.
It's the sort of thing you kind of want to roll your eyes at, and that there is definitely a gender angle too, but also if you're Vice President Harris and you get a cookie cake from a foreign minister, I mean, beyond wondering if you're expected to finish it, I imagine you also kind of wonder/hope, not to read too much into this, but
I hope you take me seriously, because this conference is deathly serious.
There is a lot at stake, and she's coming here to Europe at a really pivotal moment. There are a lot of questions from European leaders about the future of American politics, given that they don't know who could be president after the November elections, but also I think a lot of questions about the U.S. commitment to Europe. President Biden came into this White House pledging that America was back, that the transatlantic alliance is back, and now, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not the White House can actually keep that commitment, given, Congress has not been able to pass additional funding for Ukraine, and so even if Biden says he will be there for Ukraine for as long as it takes, how can he really keep that pledge if he can't back it up with money?
What is Harris's message going to be, and how is she going to reassure European leaders given this backdrop, given this context of what's happening at home?
Experts tell me that is the fundamental mission for Harris here, is to reassure European allies. Her staff says that she will also try to present a contrast, presumably with Donald Trump, given all that has been going on domestically, showing that Americans do believe in the value of alliances. They do believe in NATO. But this is all happening at a moment in time in which we have seen Donald Trump's vision of an isolationist America First policy increasingly popular amongst a flake of the Republican Party. This is not a fringe idea necessarily. You're seeing a number of House Republicans endorse this, and I do think there are serious questions in Europe about how long the U.S. will be a reliable, consistent partner.
And, you have to imagine that there is both a diplomatic and a domestic aspect to this, right? Because Kamala Harris is delivering this major important foreign policy address at this important conference, and this can be seen as a way of her showing the American people who might be listening to, watching news coverage, that Kamala Harris does big, important international things and is every bit as capable as Joe Biden is of being a figurehead, of being the face/voice of America overseas. And furthermore, that's not only a thing you want to telegraph to voters, which is of course important, but to foreign leaders, to show that, for example, should the aging president, God forbid, should something happen to him, or should Kamala Harris just be needed to step up a bit more under an older president in the future, should he be reelected, to sort of introduce her to these leaders and say she can also be trusted on foreign policy, to come talk to you, to come lead on a global stage.
To say she's got this, essentially.
Yeah.
Danielle, we heard Asma mention a moment ago former President Trump's long-standing isolationist rhetoric. European leaders have no doubt heard his recent comments suggesting that he would encourage Russia to attack U.S. allies, for example, if they didn't contribute to the joint security arrangement of NATO. What might that mean for the kinds of conversations that Harris is having in Munich?
You've got to imagine, I am not a European leader, but if I were one, I would be very, very, very nervous. Because yes, not only the NATO comments, but also the fact that there is so much tension, uncertainty, to say the least, in Congress about providing aid to Ukraine as it defends itself against Russia. That, not long ago, would have been a no-brainer. Looking at that and looking at the word I think of often is sclerotic nature of American politics these days, where we have a pretty relatively evenly divided country. Our elections are very close, but with the parties pulling further away from each other, the meaning of any given election means a great deal. So if you're a European leader, you're watching our elections and you're not thinking, well, good old steady America, they always come through. Now you're watching and going, wow, America isn't as steady as it used to be. Really, what it does on this global stage could mean wildly different things depending on who the leader is. And that has not been the case in the past.
I was speaking earlier with a former German ambassador. His name is Wolfgang Ischinger, and you don't often hear diplomats, I will say, speak so bluntly about politics in another country. But he told me,
and let me be very frank, I don't think that it is in the interest of America's European allies to see Donald Trump re-elected.
It was a very blunt assessment, and he told me that increasingly Europeans are thinking about a potential plan B. What will they do if the United States necessarily can't be this reliable, credible partner in the future? That being said, I don't think Europe's in a position to go it alone without the United States anytime in the near future, is what experts tell me, but they are thinking about this. And that speaks to the fact that they just don't know what will happen given the ebbs and flows and rapid polarization of American politics.
We're going to talk more in a moment about that uncertainty and the pressure it puts on Vice President Harris in Munich and what's happening here in the U.S. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Teladoc Health. There are lots of reasons for wanting to be healthy. Family, work, living a fuller life. Teladoc Health understands. Whether you have diabetes, high blood pressure, or just need to manage your weight, Teladoc Health can help. Visit teladochealth.com/what's your why for more information. That's TELADOC health/what's your why.
This message comes from NPR sponsor BetterHelp. No relationship is easy all the time. In fact, the best friendships, partnerships, and family connections come from putting in the time and effort to make them great. Give your relationship some love with BetterHelp's convenient, affordable online therapy. Visit BetterHelp.com/NPR today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/NPR.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Noom. Noom Med is a healthcare program that can help you overcome your body's biological barriers to weight loss. The program helps you understand the psychology behind your eating choices and why you have cravings. See if you qualify today at noom.com/med. That's NOOM.com/MED.
And we're back. I want to talk more about Harris's role as Vice President in the United States. Asma, why is Harris, first of all, going to this major event in Munich and not President Biden?
Well, this will be her third time going to the Munich Security Conference. It's something she's done, and it's something that President Biden himself did when he was the vice president. So I don't think it's particularly unusual for her to be here. It is fair to say that she doesn't have maybe as much experience on the diplomatic scene as many other Washington politicians. She was only a senator for 4 years in Washington before she became vice president. So a lot of her political experience wasn't necessarily in this realm. But since she's been VP, she has traveled quite a bit to Africa, Asia, Central America, the Middle East, and here in Europe as well. But I do think that there is more attention on Harris this time, this third trip to Munich, than there has been during the previous 2 trips. And the reason for that is, the elephant in the room domestically, and that is the increased attention on President Biden's age. I was speaking with an expert on vice presidencies, and he told me that, it's natural that there's going to be this increased attention on who she is, on potentially who the former President Donald Trump's VP pick is, because you don't have young candidates. You have 2 men who ostensibly will be amongst the oldest presidents in American history.
And about her domestic role, Asma, I mean, thus far we've seen her on the campaign trail talking to younger voters, voters of color, and addressing issues like reproductive rights. Is foreign policy something that Harris will begin to take on as well in a more direct way going forward?
She came into this job as vice president as the number 2 to a man who had years of foreign policy and diplomatic experience. Biden led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so usually presidents, I would say, look to their vice presidents to bring something distinct that they don't have. And for Harris, very bluntly, Joe Biden said that he wanted to pick a woman as his vice presidential pick. And so there was a lot of focus initially on her identity. I will say where she has found, I think, a very clear niche domestically has been on issues of abortion and reproductive rights. And that is a place and a space where you have seen her very actively campaigning in the U.S. and where you will likely continue to see her campaigning. And at the same time, this administration sees her to be an asset talking to key voting groups of the Democratic base that Joe Biden himself has struggled with, which are younger voters and voters of color. It's not clear to me that the vice president is, at this point in time, able to galvanize and energize those key blocks that do seem to be, I think, broadly disenchanted with some of Joe Biden's past few years in the White House, but it is certainly being put to her to try to talk to them.
Kamala Harris has proven that she can speak very compellingly on reproductive rights. It is an issue that she speaks about with a lot of feeling, a lot of what seems to me as sincerity. And it's a topic that Joe Biden, as we've talked about on this podcast before,
does not always seem and has not always been enthusiastic about talking about reproductive rights and abortion specifically. As to the identity part of this, about how Joe Biden said, yes, I would like to pick a woman as my vice president. On the one hand, yes, that can allow her to speak to certain groups, but on the other hand, you would hope that wouldn't have circumscribed her role in any way. And you could perhaps read, let's give her a broader portfolio, like doing foreign policy is allowing her to reach beyond the quote-unquote women's issue of reproductive rights.
We've mentioned concerns around Biden's age, similar concerns around Trump's age. Republicans have attacked Harris as a way of highlighting those concerns around Biden, and that role on the campaign trail has also opened up an avenue of attack. Here's what Nikki Haley has been saying on the campaign trail about this.
You know what should send a chill up every person's spine? The thought of a President Kamala Harris.
Danielle, she's said things like this a few times.
Right, yeah.
What do you make of it?
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple parts to this. One is the pretty common thing of setting up a politician, specifically a woman politician, as a sort of boogeyman, or I guess boogeywoman. The way that Republicans for years made Nancy Pelosi the center of their political attack ads, even when she had little to do with what was going on in the district proper, right? And so yeah, there is that kind of history, but also you can see Republicans also thinking that if you have a president on the opposite ticket who is quite old, now you have another target to aim at. You don't just have President Biden's weaknesses to throw barbs at. You have Kamala Harris's weaknesses to throw barbs at. So you can bet that coming up in this election, Republicans are going to take any opportunity to take more swings at her than they would at, say, the running mate of someone who is a bit younger.
She's a natural target because of Biden's age, and she's an easier one because of her status as a woman of color. How is that identity shaping her status, and her perception in office? Asma?
One of the things I've heard from former staffers of Harris is that there is no model for her to do this job. That people don't have a sense of what a Kamala Harris vice presidency ought to be like, because they have never seen somebody like her in this job. And, I think to some degree that allows her flexibility and autonomy to do what she wants, but I think in other ways it doesn't provide a clear pathway for how to do the job. I would say one place in which we have seen her is, we were talking about just a minute ago, is lean really heavily into issues of reproductive rights, abortion rights, maternal health issues. She's also really prioritized trying to sort of diversify who actually has a seat at the table. But I think, to go back to the question of age, these are legitimate questions. And I will say that many Democrats realize these are legitimate questions. And they realize that the flip side of answering the Joe Biden age question is answering the Kamala Harris competency question. And, it's to that point that even just the other week in an interview we saw that Harris gave to the Wall Street Journal, she flatly said that she is able to lead. And I do anticipate seeing her try to lean more directly into answering that question.
Well, that's all for today. I'm Sarah McCammon. I covered the presidential campaign.
And Danielle Kurtzleben, I also cover the presidential campaign.
And I'm Asma Khalid. I cover the White House.
Thank you for listening to the NPR Politics Podcast.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify, the global commerce platform that helps you sell and show up exactly the way you want to. Customize your online store to your style. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/NPR.
Support for NPR and the following message come from TIAA, on a mission with Wyclef Jean to give back with Wyclef's new record, Paper Right. With TIAA, streams turn into donations to a nonprofit called First Generation Investors. Stream now wherever you get your music.
The world is changing every hour, and catching up once or twice a day might not be enough. For quick updates throughout your day, there's the NPR News Now podcast. Every hour, on the hour, we bring you up to speed on the latest news from around the world in 5 minutes. Listen now to the NPR News Now podcast from NPR.
A few years ago, our colleague Dominique Mossbergen was at a 4th of July barbecue where she struck up a conversation with someone who's a funeral director.
While everyone else was enjoying the 4th of July festivities, this funeral director and I were in the corner, and I was asking her all these questions about it.
They talked a lot about her job and what it's like. And then the funeral director said something in passing that stoked Dominique's interest.
You know, I remember her saying something about how the funeral industry has a bad reputation for price gouging customers and being notorious for certain unscrupulous practices. And that really sparked this question in my mind. Is it true that many funeral homes are taking advantage of customers at moments of vulnerability? And I wasn't sure what the answer to that question was.
And that sent Dominique on a multi-year journey. She spoke to grieving families and funeral directors. She went through thousands of pages of documents. And she found that there are bad actors in the funeral industry. And many of them have been hidden from the public, thanks to a 25-year-old deal between the industry and regulators. Welcome to The Journal, our show about money, business, and power. I'm Kate Linebaugh. It's Thursday, February 15th. Coming up on the show, how unethical funeral homes have exploited grieving families for decades.
This episode is brought to you by Empower. If you're like most people, you've had your fair share of financial questions. Questions like, will you be able to afford a third kid? Will you be able to do everything you want when you retire? What if you outlive your savings? Empower knows these questions can be stressful, so they're here to help answer your what-ifs and empower what's next. Join 18 million Americans and take control of your financial future. Tap the banner to learn more or visit empower.com.
Most people, at some point in their lives, are going to have to deal with making funeral arrangements. And it's a big expense. In the U.S., the median cost of a funeral exceeds $8,000. But it can be much higher, depending on the cost of the casket and what services are provided.
It's, you know, a really strange purchase because you're making it, especially if it's for the arrangements of a loved one, you're making it at a time when you're really vulnerable and grieving. And these purchases can be really expensive. And so it seems like this really difficult combination of, you know, you're spending a lot of money at a time when you kind of have grief brain and maybe you're not making the most sound decisions.
As Dominique started looking into the funeral industry, she found that its bad reputation went back decades. And it got a lot of attention from a book that was published in the 1960s, titled The American Way of Death.
The American Way of Death, about the rackets of the undertaking business, was a sensation.
In an interview in the 1980s, the author Jessica Mitford talked about what set her on the journey to investigate funeral homes. And it started with some trade magazines.
You know, I started reading these ones. I found a whole wonder world of the mortuary, which I hadn't known existed.
Her book showed that some funeral homes took advantage of grieving customers and upsold them. This prompted federal regulators, specifically the Federal Trade Commission, to start looking into the industry.
And what they discovered was that there were at least some of these deceptive practices. And I think the FTC was very concerned specifically around price secrecy and kind of a lack of price transparency in the industry. The FTC really believed that if customers were given as much information as possible about purchases, then those customers could make the best decisions for themselves.
This led the FTC to take action. In 1984, it enacted the so-called funeral rule.
its purpose was to increase price transparency in the funeral industry, protect consumers from unfair and deceptive practices at funeral homes, specifically around pricing and information disclosures.
How does the FTC enforce the funeral rule?
When the funeral rule was first put into effect, the FTC relied on customer complaints, and if they found that a funeral home was guilty of violating the funeral rule, they would, in some cases, send a warning letter, or if it was more egregious, they could pursue some sort of civil litigation and basically sue the funeral home and fine them.
The FTC would also send out undercover agents, like secret shoppers, who would check on compliance. And when they found violations, the FTC would sue the funeral homes. But the lawsuits were cumbersome and costly, and the funeral industry's main lobbying group, the NFDA, or the National Funeral Directors Association, felt these lawsuits were hitting their reputation. So in the 1990s, the lobbying group approached the FTC with an idea.
And the NFDA said, why don't we come up with some sort of arrangement that could benefit all parties? And that proposal was for the Funeral Rule Offenders Program.
The Funeral Rule Offenders Program? That's like the penalty box.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's pretty literal, the name. And the NFDA basically proposed to the FTC this program, and what they said was, when a funeral home is found to have violated the funeral rule during these secret shopper investigations, instead of going through the litigation route, they would have the option to join this program that the NFDA itself would run.
If a funeral home violated the rule, it would be given the option to make a payment to the government and take a training course that was run by the funeral industry group. And if it completed the training, its violations wouldn't be made public.
The benefit for the funeral home was then the FTC would not make their names public. And so, the names of the funeral homes that violated the rule but that took part in this program wouldn't be disclosed publicly.
Okay, so I'm just going to back it up a bit to make sure I understand this. You have the funeral industry's main lobbying group being the referee here. They're saying to the FTC, hey, you guys, we will take remediation out of your hands, and we will get these guys, the offenders, we will mete out justice for these guys, and we will train them up and show them the right way to be funeral directors.
Yeah, that's right. I think one consumer advocate who I spoke to, the way she put it was, it's like foxes guarding the hen house.
So what has this Funeral Rule Offenders Program done to the industry? Has it reduced price gouging and bad behavior among funeral homes?
Well, since 1996, when the program was first instituted, compliance has actually worsened and not improved the way that they thought the program would help improve compliance, and it seems like it hasn't done that.
From 1996 to 2018, about 500 funeral homes have participated in the program. Over that time, the FTC inspected about 3,000 funeral homes out of more than 20,000 in the U.S. What does the FTC say about this program?
The FTC told us that basically it thinks that the program has been helpful to consumers, and so they say that, it was a cost-effective way to improve compliance, the program that is. But, I think the FTC also has said to us that this program isn't etched in stone and could be changed. So it'll be interesting to see if that is something that they're considering, though they have not made any statements suggesting that they are rethinking the program.
Regardless, people still say that deceptive practices continue.
Yeah, based on the reporting, it definitely seems like unfair and deceptive practices do continue in the industry. And what I've been hearing from consumer advocates and customers and from funeral directors themselves is that the Funeral Rule Offenders Program has allowed these unfair and deceptive practices to continue to flourish.
Coming up, one woman's story about how hard it was to get clear price information for her mother's funeral.
You've seen the headlines. Bonds are making a comeback. But if you've ever tried to invest in bonds, you know what a clunky, complicated, broken experience it can be. That's why at Public, we took fixed income and fixed it. Now you can find, evaluate, and buy thousands of bonds with an investing experience designed this century. Add fixed income to your portfolio with corporate, treasury, and municipal bonds. Go to public.com/thejournal to get started. This podcast is sponsored by Public. Full disclosures can be found at public.com/bonds.
This episode is brought to you by ServiceNow. Everyone's talking about AI. Everyone. But where do you start? How can it actually help your business? The ServiceNow platform brings intelligence into every corner of your company. So every person, every system, every process, everything works better. Put AI to work. Tap the banner or go to servicenow.com/GenAI to see how.
Courtney Stewart's ancestral home is in southwestern Virginia, in a town called Marion.
It's a quintessential, picturesque, small town nestled in rural Appalachia, Virginia. It's the home of where Mountain Dew was invented. It's a small town of cooperation where neighbors know each other, and when someone dies, you get lots of casseroles with names labeled on the Pyrex dishes so you can return them to the proper person. And it's just a wonderful little town, and I love it with all my heart.
In 2012, Courtney's mother, who lived in Marion, passed away. And Courtney had a clear idea of the kind of funeral she wanted for her mother. What did you want?
We wanted a simple cremation in a cardboard box. We didn't want a viewing. We didn't want the funeral home services at all. We weren't going to use the building. We were going to do after the church, everybody was going to come to our house. We were going to handle everything. That all I needed was for them to cremate her.
But when she went to meet with a funeral home, she felt like they were trying to sell her on extra products and services.
There was, well, we can write the obituary, and we can have thank you cards, and we can have a guest book, and don't you need help with parking? It was a little bit of a constant, here's all the services we offer. So I was very clear that that's all I wanted, was just the cremation services.
And how much did that cost?
It ended up costing a little over $5,000, as I recall. And I thought that was a lot for what we were asking.
Courtney paid the bill, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that it was too high. So she called up an advocacy group, the Funeral Consumers Alliance. The woman who answered told Courtney that there were cheaper options in the area. One of them offered something called direct cremation for about $1,000.
I said, well, what's the address of that place? I drove up and down Main Street looking for the address, and it dawned on me that it's the same funeral home that cremated my mother.
The funeral director ran 2 businesses out of the same location, and Courtney went in to confront him.
I said, what's going on here? Why didn't you give me that price? You have this service called direct cremation. And he said, well, you didn't ask for direct cremation. You asked for me. And that I gave you my services. I said, but you have this thing called direct cremation. I didn't know I was supposed to ask for that.
When you learned about direct cremation and you talked with your funeral director about it, how did that experience make you feel?
I was frustrated. I felt that there was miscommunication. I felt that I even asked, where's the flyer on direct cremation here in your office? Where is it on the price list that you gave me? Because if it had said direct cremation on that price list as one of my options, I would have said, oh, what's that? And I would have said, that's what I want. But I didn't know to ask for that. So I was astonished that I wasn't offered that when that was exactly what I was describing that I wanted. Oh, you want direct cremation.
After the confrontation, the funeral director gave her a refund of about $2,000. What do you think needs to change about how the industry operates?
It's all about transparency. I think that there needs to be a uniform price listing format, and I hope it changes. I hope there's more transparency and people know what their options are. I still think most people will continue to do elaborate funerals, and there's something beautiful about that as well. And maybe some people would disagree on how I handled my parents' end of life, but it was right for us.
Courtney's experience with the funeral home in Marion happened decades after the funeral rule was passed. And Dominique found many cases where consumers today felt like they weren't given fair pricing information.
You know, I think a common story that I heard was that people felt that in the moment when they were working with a funeral home to make arrangements, they were in a bad place. Understandably, they were really stressed and grieving and not in the best headspace, not necessarily in a space where they were making the best decisions. And many people told me that they felt very, sometimes kind of guilt-tripped into buying more than they wanted. I think a tactic that I heard of was people being told, well, your mom deserved this, or your dad would have wanted this, or something along those lines. And people express feeling like guilt was used in these conversations to compel them to spend more. Some people said that they felt bullied into buying packages at the funeral home.
Why is this so hard to fix?
I think there's this sense that perhaps the funeral rule hasn't gone far enough to protect customers, that it's too outdated and too limited in scope to have really had a huge impact on consumers.
And so 2 years ago, you set out on this reporting. What is your takeaway?
I think, you know, there are a lot of funeral professionals who got into the business because they really want to serve people. And like in any industry, there are bad actors. And I think what's challenging in the funeral industry is that you have these especially and uniquely vulnerable customers. And so I think if there are bad actors, the impact can be quite immense for a customer. And it does seem that the mechanisms that have been put in place to protect consumers, or that are supposed to protect consumers, aren't doing as good a job as, you know, the folks who put them in place originally maybe had hoped.
That's all for today, Thursday, February 15th. If you like our show, follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. We're out every weekday afternoon. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.
Hey, Hotels.com here. Tired of the everyday? We know a hotel that's ready to unwind this weekend. Book hotels with spas in the Hotels.com app. Find your perfect somewhere.
Rafah is the southernmost city in Gaza. It had a population of about 200,000 people, but after Israel declared war on Hamas after the attacks of 10/7, more than 1 million Palestinians fled south to Rafah. They have nothing. They exist between the sky and the land, a reporter told us. Despite criticism, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu plans a ground invasion of Rafah.
I think the people who are telling you, oh, you can't do it, you can't go into Rafah under any conditions, are basically saying, don't win, lose.
Facing all of this, some people taking refuge there have just stopped wondering what comes next.
If the people thought of what will happen after the ceasefire or after the end of this war, they will die. They will die. They will die.
Coming up on Today Explained, can 4 months of frantic diplomacy lead to a ceasefire before Rafah's destruction?
American Idol goes all over the nation. The hometowns big and small.
In search of America's next superstar.
ABC Sunday. Home is where the dream starts.
Music tells our own personal story.
Idol is where the dream takes off.
I did the biggest thing I thought I could do, an audition for American Idol.
You're going to Hollywood. American Idol premieres Sunday, 8/7 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Tax Act can think of a million things more fun than filing taxes. Tax Act is going to name some now. Sitting in traffic. Folding a fitted bedsheet. Listening to your coworker talk about his fantasy team. Digging a hole. Digging an even larger hole next to that original hole. Unfortunately, Tax Act's filing software can't make taxes fun. But Tax Act can help you get them done. Tax Act. Let's get them over with.
This is Today Explained. I am Asil Musa, a Palestinian freelance journalist from the Gaza Strip. I work for The Guardian, The Intercept, Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, and Electronic Intifada. I have been working as a journalist for 2.5 years. Now I am in the city of Rafah, in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. This is my second displacement. Actually, on 13th of October, the Israeli authorities ordered the residents of the Gaza Strip to evacuate the northern Gaza Strip and to So, consequently, my family and I sought refuge in Al Maghazi refugee camp, where we stayed at my grandfather's house along with approximately 40 other displaced individuals. The situation there was dire. We faced severe shortages of food, running water, and even the drinkable water, and even Israel claimed that area as a safe area. I lost 10 people of my family. Israel targeted the house of my cousins, and as a result, 10 of my relatives were killed. 7 of them were children, and 1 of them was a woman, and the other was a young man.
That's what brought Asil and her surviving family to Rafah, down by Gaza's border with Egypt. Rafah was a safe zone, but the Israeli offensive that began up north has now come to Gaza's southernmost point. So to the north is all destruction, and to the south is Egypt, where most Palestinians can't go. Asil and more than 1 million other people are trapped.
Now I can hear the Israeli bombardment. I can see the civilians. I can see the people who are living in tents and in undescribable situations. On Monday, The residents of Rafah, along with the displaced people, endured a night of terror beyond description. It was a deadly night. The Israeli occupation unleashed a barrage of missiles and artillery shells on the city, resulting in the tragic loss of approximately 100 civilian lives. So that night, the house of refuge I am in was shaking. The windows of that house shattered. Actually, I consider myself super lucky to be in a house. The majority of people are now in the streets and the tents. They are enduring a severe cold. They don't have even clothes. Actually, I borrowed clothes from my cousins. When people left their homes and were displaced, they only took their IDs, their passports, their very essential needs. People cannot hold all the things that they may need to another home or to another tent or to another refuge area or shelter. The Israeli bombardment is hard in itself, being under fire, under bombardment. But being under bombardment without even the essential needs such as food, water, medical supplies, medicines is making the problem or the tough time harder than enduring it with only bombing.
As a journalist, you are also interviewing people in Rafah. What are you hearing that you think we should know?
Okay, today I was in an interview with two sisters who are married to two brothers. They were in Khan Yunis. They were in a building with their husbands and children, and they are civilians. The Israeli occupation targeted their home, leaving their husbands killed. ordering them or instructing them or forcing them to leave their home. After bombing it, they let the women, who are these two ladies, Sahar and Ibtisam, they forced Sahar and Ibtisam and their children to evacuate this home. The two ladies told me, Asil, we left our husbands in the streets, the body of their husbands, they are killed, and we ran with our children, and we walked for a long time to reach a safer area. I cannot even imagine how they endured this. They left the bodies of their husbands on the streets. Sahar told me, Asil, I didn't have the chance to even hug him or to kiss his head or even to protect his body or to bury him. Actually, this was the hardest thing I hear today. In a different interview, I met family who are displaced for 3 times. They are staying in a tent, in a very small tent. They actually have nothing to eat. They have even the simplest essentials. They don't have them in the tent. They told me that, Asil, that Monday night was terrifying. The situation was undescribable. We were very afraid. We decided to leave Rafah and to relocate once again, but we don't know where to go.
Asil, much of the international community is really angry about what's happening in Rafah. There is an understanding that people have been pushed into Rafah and have no place else to go. And so why would Israel conduct a bombardment of this place that essentially feels like a last stand for civilians? Now, when Israel is asked about that, Israeli leaders say Rafah is the last Hamas stronghold. This is now where Hamas is hiding, is located. Does that strike you as a correct assessment? You're laughing.
Yeah, I'm laughing. They are killing the children, women. They are targeting hospitals. They are targeting schools. They are killing journalists. The correspondent of Al Jazeera, Wael al-Dahdouh, they killed his wife, his daughters, his sons. And I'm just laughing. They are like saying they are looking for Hamas. The hospitals are not Hamas. The killing of approximately 30,000 people, the majority of them are women and children. Where's Hamas? Where's Hamas between the civilians? And they ordered the residents to relocate to Rafah. Now we are over 1.3 million Palestinians in Rafah. But let me tell you something. Israel is killing people without getting any accountable. They see that the whole world fails Palestinians in Gaza. They left Palestinians in Gaza to be killed, to be wounded, to be targeted, to be bombed. They are not looking for Hamas. They are trying to kill the whole Gazans. This is what I can see. And in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, there is a real starvation. My friend just asked me, Asil, if you can't help me to get any wheat flour, we don't have food. I asked him to go to my bombed house and look for any kind of food if he can't find it under the rubble. People are now looking for food from under the rubble. They are eating the food of the animals. And we are talking about Hamas. No, Israel is not targeting Hamas. It's targeting the Palestinian people.
So what Israel is conducting is an aerial bombardment, but Israeli troops have not entered into Rafah. Are people in Rafah expecting a ground invasion?
Yes, we are expecting a ground invasion. Yes, we are. And if the prospect of a ground invasion into Rafah happened, it would be a catastrophe, as 1.3 million people are already displaced in Rafah. So the people now have no place to go to.
And is there any way to prepare for this?
What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? We stay in the houses, in the tents, in the streets, in the shelters, waiting to be killed. We don't have plan F. We made the plan A, plan B, plan C, and we have no more plans.
Asil Musa. She's a twice-displaced Palestinian journalist in Rafah, where backup plans have been rendered useless and people only focus on survival.
We don't have the luxury to think of the aftermath. We only think how to survive day by day. We think of how to flee from being killed.
Now, there is a method by which the world deals with such catastrophes, and that method is diplomacy. Like Asil, we wondered where diplomatic efforts stand, and we have answers coming up.
Support for Today Explained comes from American History Tellers, the Underground Railroad. That is a podcast from Wondery. It's about how slavery tightened its grip on Americans in the decades before the Civil War and how a diverse group of abolitionists began to construct a clandestine path to freedom for the enslaved. It's hosted by Lindsey Graham, but not that Lindsey Graham. Wondery's podcast, American History Tellers, takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans, our values, our struggles, and our dreams. You can follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to this season of American History Tellers, the Underground Railroad, early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
Hi everyone, I'm Brene Brown, and this is Unlocking Us. In this podcast, we'll explore ideas, stories, experiences, research, books, film, music, anything that reflects the universal experiences of being human, from the bravest moments to the most brokenhearted. Some episodes will be conversations with the people who are teaching me, challenging me, confusing me, maybe ticking me off a little bit. Some days I'll just talk directly to you about what I'm learning and how it's changing the way I think and feel. Episodes of Unlocking Us start on February 28th. We're going to do 3 or 4-part series every quarter, so about 12 to 15 episodes a year, and they'll drop on Wednesdays. And now, you can find me wherever you normally listen to your podcasts. You can get new episodes as soon as they're published by following Unlocking Us on your favorite podcast app. As usual, always stay awkward, brave, and kind.
This is Today Explained.
My name is Anton LaGuardia. I'm the diplomatic editor of The Economist, which means I write about foreign policy and national security.
All right, so this war has been underway for about 4 months and 1 week. What has diplomacy looked like so far in this conflict? How would you characterize it?
Well, it's been intense. There's a lot of flying. There's a lot of time spent in planes and convoys and marble palaces. Anthony Blinken has been to the region 5 times so far since October 7th.
I'm back first and foremost to consult directly with our partners on the joint efforts to bring all of the remaining hostages home.
This particular negotiation, I think, has been difficult because it's working at 3 levels. One is to mitigate the humanitarian impact of the conflict of Palestinians. And the second part of it is to try and get an immediate ceasefire and hostage deal. And the third and hardest element is try and connect all this to a bigger regional peace deal that tries to, at its most ambitious, end more than a century of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians.
President Biden has said
the United States will do everything possible to make it happen.
What does that include? What's on offer?
Well, what's on offer is something akin to what happened in November. If you remember, there was a 1-week pause in which several dozen hostages and prisoners were released.
After nearly 7 weeks of intense fighting, finally a day of peace. As the temporary truce took hold, a moment so many have been anxiously waiting for.
The idea is to do it again and do it on a much bigger scale. So they're talking about a 6-week pause in the fighting, renewable, and then there's obviously bargaining going on about 2 main things. One is exactly who gets released in what sequence in exchange for what. And the other thing is, does this lead to a permanent cessation in the fighting or not?
And what kind of progress is being made?
At the moment, seemingly little. There was hope a week or two ago that things were fluid and moving. Both sides seemed interested in a deal, but we've just heard that after the latest round of talks between intelligence chiefs, including Bill Burns, the director of the CIA in Cairo, the Israelis have said the delegation is not going back to Cairo, and this has obviously caused much consternation and anger among the families of the hostages, who feel that not enough is being done to get their loved ones home.
What accounts for the logjam in negotiations? Is there one particular perspective holding things up?
I think it's a number of things. The hardest point is that Hamas wants a full cessation of violence and a full Israeli withdrawal. Israel wants a temporary cessation of the fighting and the ability to keep fighting until total victory, as the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu puts it. So Hamas is not going to release its hostages if it thinks the Israelis are going to come back at them. And Israel says we have to finish this fight so that Hamas is destroyed. So that's, I think, the biggest problem.
We're seeing reports that President Biden is growing very frustrated.
There was some reporting this morning that President Biden told some campaign donors that Prime Minister Netanyahu, quote, has been a pain in my ass lately, or, quote, he's been killing me lately.
What's your sense of where Joe Biden is right now, both the pressure he's under and the ways in which his mind may have changed or be changing as this thing continues, this conflict?
Well, I don't sit in the White House, but the one thing that Joe Biden has never done is put restrictions on the weapons that he's prepared to send Israel. At the same time, he has wanted greater restraint in the way Israel conducts its operations, has done a lot to try and get more humanitarian aid in, to try and convince Israelis to think about the civilian population. This comes in part from America's own experience of counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, where America learned the hard way that sheer military power is not enough, you need a political dimension, and he's tried hard to get the Israelis to think about the day after. The trouble is that the day after that he sees and that Netanyahu sees are very different. Joe Biden wants a path that ultimately leads to a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel.
With the Israeli security guaranteed and Palestinian aspirations for their own state fulfilled. I say this as a lifelong supporter of Israel. That's the only path that guarantees Israel's security for the long term.
Bibi Netanyahu will hear nothing of it because he says a Palestinian state will merely create another terrorist state on our borders, this time on the West Bank.
In any future arrangement, Israel needs security control over all territory west of the Jordan. I tell this truth to our American friends. The Prime Minister needs to be capable of saying no to our friends, saying no when necessary, and saying yes when possible.
So they disagree fundamentally about where they want to go, although they're still more or less in lockstep on the current aims of the war. But even here, you're seeing some parting of the way. So, for example, the Americans say the aim is to ensure Hamas can never do October the 7th again, which is not quite the same as what Bibi Netanyahu says, which is total victory in the destruction of Hamas. And I think that implies a realization on the American side that something will remain of Hamas, even as a political idea or as a religious movement. You're not going to be able to eradicate that. And Netanyahu seems to want a much more maximalist aim. And then there are the kind of repercussions for America's position in the Middle East. So you're seeing an escalating and worsening second front with the so-called axis of resistance. These are the Iranian groups sponsored by Iran in Lebanon, in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and where America has now taken, 3 fatalities under attack, has retaliated, and there is a worry that the more this goes on, the worse it will get, and the harder it will be to bottle up again. So, for all those reasons, you're seeing tension between the two leaders, and one of the things that really seems to have irked Netanyahu is a move to impose sanctions on a small number of settlers deemed violent in the West Bank.
4 settlers facing financial sanctions and visa bans from the U.S.
Which is really a sort of warning shot. It's going after not Netanyahu himself, but after his right-wing coalition. and to some extent after Netanyahu's base among settlers. And this is a move that's been followed by Europeans. France took similar measures. Britain has done the same. And I think there's a worry that this is going to start to exert real pressure on the settler movement, or certainly the more extreme fringe of it.
Benjamin Netanyahu is also under pressure from many sides, and at the moment he's warning of a ground invasion in Rafah. We talked to a journalist there earlier, and she says people there are expecting that. Is that changing diplomatic efforts at all?
I think it's adding urgency to the effort to try and wind down the war, if not stop it, and then try to get into a diplomatic process that leads to wider settlement. But Netanyahu has a consideration. The Israeli public has moved to the right. For all the demonstrations that you're seeing on the streets of Israel, it is not a demand for peace now of the kind that was seen after the Lebanon War in 1982. The belief that peace with Palestinians is possible has been greatly eroded since the Oslo Accords of '93 for a number of reasons, not least of which is the Second Intifada of the 2000s and now October the 7th. So though there's urgency to get there, I think it's just much harder to do it. And there's also mistrust on the Palestinian side of the Israelis, the weakness and discrediting of Abu Mazen. This is Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader in the West Bank, who's now in the 18th and 19th year of what is supposed to be a 4-year term. And there's, of course, the tragedy of what's happening in Gaza itself.
Is anyone at this point speaking with any level of specificity about what comes after this war? Is anyone talking about how Gaza... Who rebuilds it?
Yes, but it is in the middle distance rather than in the within reach. Nobody wants to rebuild stuff that's going to get bombed again. So the Arabs are saying we will do humanitarian help, but we will not do reconstruction until there is a full cessation of this conflict and there is a real path towards a deal that includes a Palestinian state. So the promise is there, but it's not going to be acted upon until we get much greater clarity.
Let me ask you a last very big picture diplomatic question, if I can. Before 10/7, Israel was normalizing relations with neighboring Arab countries. Is there any hope of that resuming at any point in the near future?
You would have thought not, just because emotions are so fired up at the moment and the profound lack of trust. But going around with the Americans in the Middle East, there is this kind of surprising sense that Saudi Arabia in particular, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, really wants to settle this matter. And that he's willing to do big things if he gets Israelis to move on Palestinian statehood. And those big things will include recognition of Israel, peaceful diplomatic relations, but seemingly also some kind of Arab guarantee to Israel to try and offer it reassurance that it will be safe in the future. What is included in those security guarantees is unclear, but it seems to be formalizing some of the things that happen: intelligence sharing, military exercises, joint air defenses, and so on. But that's kind of the 10th step. they need to get onto the first step, which is stopping the fighting. No Arab leader can move until the fighting stops and the human misery ends. And then you need to get into a ceasefire, and then you need to get to an Israeli commitment for Palestinian state.
That was Anton LaGuardia, diplomatic editor of leading magazine The Economist. Our thanks as well to Maram Hamid of Al Jazeera English. Today's episode was produced by Avishai Artsy and edited by Amina El-Sadi. It was fact-checked by Kim Eggleston and Laura Bullard, and David Herman is our engineer. I'm Noelle King. It's Today Explained. Don't be fooled by the rocks that I got. We are calling Jenny from
Wisconsin.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. Sorry.
I'm Ryan, this is Tony.
We're doing karaoke.
No, I liked it. Let's call Jenny from Wisconsin. She used to have a little, now she got a lot.
Yeah. And everywhere she goes, she knows where she came from. She's married to Ben Affleck.
How's Ben? Pretty crook as always, yeah?
Yeah. He's outside having a cigarette looking sad right now.
Hello?
Jenny! It's Tony and Ryan, how you doing?
Oh my gosh.
Jenny, just before you answered, I was singing Jenny from the block, so we're basically picturing your life being like just like Jennifer Lopez, so you're welcome.
Yeah.
We've painted a lovely picture
Yeah,
for you.
that's my dream life.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I prefer that reference over the Forrest Gump one, because they're basically calling me a druggie, so
Yeah, whatever.
Not great.
And does everyone, I don't want to say, because you've probably heard it 5,000 times, but everyone says it in an accent.
Everyone does it. Yeah, I bet. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
we
it's taking
gave you
every ounce of my
J-Lo.
being to not do that.
Don't do it. We gave you J-Lo, Jen, so you're welcome
Yeah,
for that.
we're not fooled by the rocks that she got. So, Jenny,
thank you.
will you approve today's podcast?
of course I will. I love you guys.
She used to have a little and now she's got a lot.
Hey, this is Jenny from Wisconsin, and I approve this podcast.
Alright, coming up today.
Happy New Year.
Thanks, mate. It is a good year. I'm excited for this month.
Are ya?
Yeah.
This year?
Yeah.
That's great news.
Yeah.
Oh, video show.
Video show, welcome.
Hello.
Welcome to the video show. You can watch this on the Spotify app or on the smart TV.
Yeah, cast it to your smart TV.
Watch your names along the bottom if you're a tarper.
Yes.
If you're a 9-year-old tarper, exclusive or champion.
Yep, in our Patreon. Yep, everyone's a tarper.
Yeah, and coming up today, I've been encouraging Tony to do something, and I'm scared that it's backfired. Let that sigh give you a clue. That's all we'll say. We'll get to it.
like a cluster. Yeah, just keep going. I'm coming, and just keep going. Stupid. Accident. Yeah, that looks like an accident. Perfect. sleepy.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Sattva. Sattva luxury mattresses are every bit as elegant as the most expensive brands, but because they're sold online, they're about half the price. Visit SAATVA.com/NPR and save an additional $200.
Every year around this time, my inner Larry David comes popping out because of Valentine's Day. Now, I know I'm not original in feeling this way, but Valentine's Day is kind of like the worst of the modern manufactured holidays, because it's a day when we're all reminded of ideal love stories, when we're pushed to express romantic love in scripted ways, where it kind of just all feels forced. But for most of my life, I think this was just me being a curmudgeon, just being who I am. I don't think I started to actually understand the deeper reasons for why I dislike Valentine's Day so much until a few years ago. I suddenly found myself single after separating from my partner, a partner who I share a child with. I'll spare you all the details, but basically after I figured out how to adjust to my new reality, to co-parent, etc., I started thinking about dating again. Now imagine, I'm in my 30s, the last time I dated was before dating apps existed, and I'm going into it with my 20th century sensibilities. In the beginning, it was brutal. I couldn't figure out how to match with anyone. My profile was terrible. I remember sharing my profile with Run and her just laughing. It felt so weird swiping on faces, like I was shopping for a new drum set. Sometimes dates would be awkward, probably mostly because of me. Other times, people would just disappear. Sometimes I'd want to disappear. Of course, it wasn't all bad. I met some amazing people, but I always felt like something was off about all of it. I felt like the search for a partner had been twisted and commodified into this detached consumer activity, kind of like what we did to love with Valentine's Day. And I really wanted to know if other people experienced it the same way I did. So I thought, why don't we ask all of you, our listeners from all over the world, what your experiences have been with modern love and with online dating. And man, did y'all come through.
Let's see, Tinder.
No. Not my type.
It was kind of just like a fun, like, little hot or not, little game on my phone.
Logan.
Australia.
Not my type. Mom.
Why is he 6'1"?
I like to say I was playing Tinder.
Then you think, oh, I have a Rolodex of people that I'm counting on and meeting.
I've gone to see The Big Lebowski in Athens with a guy I met on an app.
I was just in this forest hiking with this person I just met, and I was like, what the fuck am I doing?
But you don't stop to realize that maybe I am just a person on a lot of other people's Rolodexes.
It turned into like a new form of doom scrolling.
Swipe right, what, 2, like 3.
Chase is not my type.
4, 5.
Ryan, not my type. Jordan, no. Chevy, not my type.
22, 23, 24, 25. I'm about to get arthritis or some sort of disability in my hand.
I literally just went through the entire viable Boulder population in 1 minute.
And I was also thinking, oh my gosh, this is what people are gonna do towards me.
I usually only go on these apps now for like 30 seconds at a time before I get distressed.
So it ends up being just this like desert of really shallow initial interactions where you're just basically window shopping people.
We heard over and over from you, the listeners, these complicated stories of struggling with dating, with a sense of alienation. And then when we looked into the data, it actually supports those stories. Today, the number of young people in America who are single is the highest it's been in decades. Despite the fact that meeting someone today doesn't require much more than swiping on your phone, people who are looking for long-term relationships are lonelier than ever. It's what Niobe Way, a researcher from NYU, calls a crisis of connection. Naturally, I had to ask, why is it like this? How did love, this thing that's supposed to be beautiful, magical, transformative, turn into this never-ending slog? So I did what I do. I went searching for answers. And I talked to some of the people who are on the cutting edge of studying the past and present of love and dating. On this episode of Throughline from NPR, I'm going to take you on a time-hopping philosophical journey into the origins of modern love.
Hi, I'm Michelle from Kirkland, Washington, and I'm here with my friend Dina.
مرحبا أنا دينا من الأردن مع دفاع أصبح حاليا في دبي.
And you're listening to Throughline on NPR.
This message comes from Apple Card. Earn 3% daily cash back when you use Apple Card to buy a new Apple Vision Pro or any products at Apple and automatically grow your daily cash at 4.50% annual percentage yield when you open a savings account. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone, subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners, subject to eligibility. Savings accounts by Goldman Sachs Bank, USA, member FDIC. Terms apply. Support for NPR and the following message come from TIAA, on a mission with Wyclef Jean to give back with Wyclef's new record, Paper Right. With TIAA, streams turn into donations to a nonprofit called First Generation Investors. Stream now wherever you get your music. Support for NPR and the following message come from TIAA. Wyclef Jean and TIAA are on a mission to give back. More than half of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So the new single, Paper Right, is on a mission to start closing the gap. With TIAA, streams turn into donations to a nonprofit called First Generation Investors that teaches students how to invest. Stream now and help them stack for a great cause.
Part 1. The Self.
Love. Love is an encounter. This is why in English and also in some other languages, not all, like French, you use the term fall. We fall in love.
I started my journey into the origins of love with someone whose words have always resonated with me, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek. This is him talking about love on the website Big Think.
Let's say you live a happy life. You are lucky, you have a job, you meet regularly with friends. Then all of a sudden, in a totally contingent way, let's say you stumble on the street, somebody helps you to stand up, it's a young girl or boy, blah blah, and of course, it's the love of your life.
What Žižek is describing is the idealized Western version of romance. It's the one where love comes out of passion and random chance.
Man, this is busy too.
Can be that your whole life changes. Nothing is the same, as they say.
Žižek says that when you fall in love and get in a relationship with someone, it naturally rearranges your life. And that rearrangement can be scary and risky, because what if you change everything and it doesn't work out? Well, he says to try to minimize the risks of falling in love, we use technology, like with dating apps, where we can vet partners like products.
What they offer us is precisely love without the fall, without falling in love. We want today the thing without the price we have to pay for it. We want sugar without calories, so we have sweeteners. We want beer without alcohol. It fits perfectly this superficial consumerist attitude.
Okay, so I'm not endorsing Zizek or his ideas. In fact, I'm not even sure if I agree with him here. Obviously, we're not all engaging in this consumerist way with love, even if society is pushing us in that direction. But his provocative point brought up some really fundamental questions for me. Like, where does this idealized version of romantic love come from? Why do we simultaneously idealize it and fear it? And this sent me down a wormhole for days, weeks, and I eventually landed in an unexpected place. France in the late 1700s.
The French Revolution is so massive.
This is Andrea Wolff, who wrote the book that took me here. It's called Magnificent Rebels, The First Romantics and the Invention of the Self.
No one in Europe is really unaffected by this.
The French Revolution tried to end monarchy and feudalism. They tried to end a world of
control, of despotism, and of inequality.
Most people in France, and basically everywhere, were ruled over by dictators who
can determine pretty much every detail in their subjects' lives.
But the revolutionaries in France didn't just want to take power. They were trying to completely change the way society worked.
Words are more powerful than weapons. When the French revolutionaries declare all men equal, they at least promise the possibility of a society that is built on the power of ideas.
The ideas of the French Revolution spread across Europe quickly. They inspired a movement that would come to be called Romanticism. Romanticism was this period in Europe where writers, musicians, and artists started emphasizing the need for individualism and appreciation for the human emotional experience. And that period is where many historians say the original ideas of modern romantic love took shape. Today, authors who wrote in English, like Mary Shelley, William Wordsworth, and Edgar Allan Poe, are associated with Romanticism. But when Andrea Wolff went looking for the original Romantics, she found them somewhere other than France or England.
I came across this story about a group of rebellious young thinkers and philosophers who all came together at the end of the 18th century in a tiny, and I mean really tiny little German town called Jena. That's where Romanticism is launched as an international movement.
Jena was a small college town. Only about 4,500 people lived there. But among those people, there were world-class writers and thinkers, the who's who of German art and literature.
There's the Germany's most famous poet Goethe. There is the famous playwright Friedrich Schiller. You have famous philosophers, you have literary critics, and they're all incredibly young. Now what happens then is there's the inner circle of this group, and they all move together into one house.
A group house. A group house where people shared everything. Like everything.
They don't just live together, they work together, and they love together. It's just such a mess who's sleeping with whom. There's really a lot of affairs and fun and sex going around in this house.
And this is Germany in the 1790s, not exactly California in the 1960s.
This is Germany's first commune.
And the person at the center of that commune is a woman who, let's just say, lived an out-of-the-box life.
For me, the most important person in the story, if I can introduce her with all her names, she's called Caroline Michaelis Böhmer Schlegel-Schelling.
Carolina Schlegel-Schelling was born in Göttingen, Germany in 1763. She was the daughter of a university professor and was educated and empowered from childhood. She grew up to be a very serious intellectual.
She was such a razor-sharp mind. There were quite a lot of intellectuals who said, I don't ever want to get into an intellectual duel with Caroline Schlegel.
She was small and slender, but had this really big presence.
Everybody talked about how her eyes were like on fire, and she had these kind of sparkling blue eyes. She had this kind of mop of kind of big curly hair. She is fiercely independently minded.
Widowed at 24, she refused to remarry until and unless she wanted to. She moved to the city where the idea of the French Revolution was gaining support and threw herself into that world. She ended up getting imprisoned for her political views.
In prison, she discovers that she's pregnant after a one-night stand with a 19-year-old French soldier.
Wow.
Quite something. At a time when it was scandalous behavior if you're just on your own with a man.
With the help of friends, she got out of jail and gave birth. Eventually, she remarried to her second husband, an intellectual named August Wilhelm Schlegel. Together, they moved to Jena. And it's there in Jena that Carolina begins to really shine. Her home became the place where that core group of thinkers and artists, the first Romantics, lived together.
Her personality really determines the kind of rhythm and the tempo of their discussion. So if they were an orchestra, she's really the conductor who brings the score alive.
Carolina and her friends organized readings, discussions, debates, all inspired by a very basic but revolutionary idea: the self.
So they live in Jena at a time when there is a very famous philosopher called Fichte. And Fichte is so hugely popular that more than half of Jena's students go to his lectures. So he's the one who puts the self at center stage.
My will alone shall float audaciously and boldly over the wreckage of the universe.
He basically says that there are no God-given or absolute truth. The only certainty we have is we have the self, and that the world is experienced by the self.
A person should be self-determined, never letting himself be defined by anything external.
At that time, it was such a revolutionary idea that it's not God or a king who has kind of decided everything. It is us. In Germany, it's called the Ich.
Fichte's ideas about the power of the self inspired Carolina and her friends.
As they meet in Carolina's salon, every day, every evening, that are the ideas they discuss. They read these lectures because they are published to each other. They discuss it. They talk about what then becomes Romanticism.
The Bohemians in Jena took this idea of the self and used it to develop bigger ideas. They emphasized sexual freedom. They pushed against the limits of logic and science. They revered nature and the imagination. And all of this came out in their work.
They published works, they published books, but they also published a literary magazine called the Athenaeum, a title that stood for freedom, education, liberty. And Carolina is the editor. So she has an incredible, powerful role behind the scenes. And it is in the Athenaeum, in the pages of the Athenaeum, that they first use Romanticism in its new literary meaning.
Carolina also helped her husband, August Schlegel, translate 16 of Shakespeare's plays into German. Those translations went on to become incredibly popular. Meanwhile, the Romantics in England picked up the baton from the Jena collective. Some of them even learned German so they could really understand their ideas. And it was those English Romantics that really exported the ideas of Romanticism around the world. But Andrea Wolf warned me,